Okay, good. Welcome everyone at the Digital Architects Network with a special session in close togetherness with Avolution. You'll probably notice I'm using a different language today. First of all, welcome Andrew Lewthwaite. He's English, and I see also some English people on the call. So I think it is good practice to keep this in English, and the presentation is in English as well. Right, like I said, we have a very interesting session. A lot of people registered. It is going to be recorded. We will post the session later on the YouTube channel and the library. And how do we do this today? Andrew has a presentation. Of course, you can use the chat box to chat, answer questions, etc. But Andrew just told me he has room for Q&A at the end of the session, so we can open up the microphone. I have muted all people, and I will continuously do so while when people unmute. So welcome, Andrew. Andrew is working with Avolution, and you might recognize Andrew if you have been on the Digital Architecture Design Day, where we met. And so this actually came to this session about data-driven enterprise modeling to drive business value. So, Andrew, without further ado, please welcome.
That's great. Thank you very much, Peter. And yes, apologies, it is going to be in English. Maybe give me a few more years to learn and it might not be. But yeah, thank you everyone for joining. I know obviously time-wise, we've got people joining from across really. I know we have people from the UK, potentially people from the US here as well. So yeah, really appreciate everyone joining. And like we said, the topic for today, so data-driven enterprise modeling to drive business value, is essentially what we'll be covering. And I'll deep dive into some of the key aspects for what you actually hopefully get out of today in terms of value yourselves. And of course, like Peter mentioned, there'll be time for questions at the end as well. So if you wanted to write those into the chat window as we go, so you don't lose track of what you were thinking of asking, of course, feel free to do that, but we will come to those at the end as well. It probably only makes sense that I quickly explain who Avolution are just before jumping into the actual topic. But don't worry, this isn't a sales presentation. It's one slide of the company. Avolution is a market leader for producing the enterprise architecture tool Abacus. We've been doing this for the past 21 years, as you can see in here. I've been doing this with Avolution for the past close to 10 years now. And we have offices worldwide. So anyone who is on here that isn't in the UK, of course, you'll have the option to speak to any other of our team members across the world. And some of you may have already seen some analyst reports in terms of where we're based as the leader in this particular market for EA tools. And that's hopefully backed up by some of you who have maybe even used Abacus before, but also thousands of other users who have provided these reviews of their use of the tool. And certainly one of the things that you'll hopefully hear today towards the end are some case studies of our customers. The other quick thing here is you can see that we're in over 100 countries. So really this is just the idea that we can span across the globe, not only from the support from the offices that we have, but really because as a tool, we're agnostic of industry and domain, and therefore we have clients across many different verticals. So that's going to be supported as well through the different frameworks and notations that we have. Again, I will come back to mention those later on as well. If any of you want to download a trial of Abacus, that's going to be freely available through our website as well. But I promise that's the last plug for the tool. So from today, there are some key areas that I want to go through. So business goals in terms of how we actually map those and how architecture can actually support those. That's going to be let's say, the majority or the fundamental part of today's session. I will touch on frameworks and how we can actually use frameworks and notation to drive some of those results. Of course, frameworks tend to go hand in hand with architecture. And then we'll also talk about how we actually communicate the value across the organization. So not just the data itself, but how do we actually present that data to different stakeholders? And then finally, like I mentioned, some real life examples as well. So data-driven modeling. So what is it? Why do we need it? And then how do we actually go about it? Firstly, it's probably worth starting with a quick quote. So this is from Sherlock Holmes, standing true probably 100 years ago and probably still true today. That it's a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Really important these days. And I think organizations are likely taking note of this a bit more as well. Much more we're seeing data-driven business strategies. And really what that means is we are making decisions based on some of the analysis of the data that we have. So the analysis side of things is using the data points, transforming that into information, and of course, building some insights into that as well. Data is obviously key for building some business initiatives. And certainly when you think of building a data-driven organization, you'll also see how analysts like Gartner and Forrester already support those types of methodologies and of course encourage those across organizations as well. Now the benefits of that are multiple, let's say. Certainly one of the first things I said we should focus on is cost saving. Any architecture team that I've worked on tends to want to drive costs down. That doesn't necessarily mean that's the direct driver. Cost savings can come from rationalization programs, fixing risks, being more compliant. So it isn't just a case that there's some direct cost savings, but really some of the data-driven decisions are also from the indirect ones as well. Also, reducing threats. So any business decisions that we make, of course, that has to be backed up by data as well. So those really data points, let's say, those real data points, really just effectively allow us to make things, I would say, risk-free to some extent, but certainly more confidently. You know, we can reduce threats and risks if we have the data. Otherwise, we're ultimately just guessing on what changes we actually need to make. The other one that I've listed in here as well is the alignment and direction of the organization. This is quite common. I think you see this much more these days. If you want to know how your prospect feels about your product, you check your data. If you're wondering how customers are satisfied with the service, you check the data. So we all have an abundance of data that we can actually analyze. It's about using that in a way that we can get some actionable insights. Certainly one of the areas I'll be covering later on in terms of some tips and tricks that can actually help along those areas as well. Now, also transparency, innovation and growth, of course, are going to be backed up by data. But all of these types of benefits are really there to help your organization evolve and grow over time. If you take a look at the most forward-thinking businesses, the majority, if not all of those, use data to unlock some of the new markets that they work into, streams of revenue that they actually can develop, and they improve and grow based on that data. And of course, that becomes the fundamental part of what we do. So those are the business benefits, let's say. But really, if we took a real world example, we can actually bring this back into how data can help in other areas. So some of you may be familiar with this picture. If not the picture, then maybe even the story itself. This is a picture of a World War II plane. And these planes, these fighter jets, would come back from the engagements during World War II. And when those planes come back, ideally what you would be doing is reviewing the statuses of those planes. Now, you of course don't want your planes getting shot down by the enemy. And so ideally what you do is actually armor those planes. Now, by applying armor to these planes during World War II, at that time it made them much heavier, they were less maneuverable, they tended to use a lot more fuel. And so the problem was you don't want to armor the planes too much. And of course, you don't want to armor the planes too little. Now, the officers in the army used the data from the planes and reviewed that you can effectively get some good efficiencies here by protecting the planes with slightly less armor if you actually concentrate that armor in the place that is needed the most. What they did was they turned to one of the statisticians who was working as a researcher at the time. So they wanted to figure out, well, how much armor belonged on the plane where those bullet holes were. Now, that researcher was Abraham Wald, and he maybe efficiently and I guess rightly so, as much as the officers weren't exactly happy at the time, determined that the holes were in these planes for specific reasons. And when the officers asked where the armor should be, he actually suggested the armor should be where the holes aren't. So the idea here was that we're actually using some of the data to predict that we should be placing this armor around areas like the engine. This actually falls into one of the things that we find quite often these days in terms of biases. This is actually what we call a survivorship bias. What's actually happening in this situation is that all the missing holes are on the missing planes. So the reason the planes weren't coming back was because if they got hit in the engine, they would go down. And therefore, we're just basing our data on these planes that have holes that were coming back. So that survivorship bias is essentially key in any organizations these days as well. And the concept is when you actually look at a given group of data, most of the time we tend to only focus on the successful individuals, i.e. the survivors, rather than actually focus on the group as a whole, i.e. the non-survivors. And we'll see this crop up later on in some of the use cases we go through. But this is the important fact that we need to look at data that we have, but also keep in mind the data that's missing. Now, that survivorship bias, of course, like I mentioned, comes into play in today's world. But really, when we look at some of the stats and when we actually take a look at some of the surveys that were run over close to maybe 4,000 senior managers, the majority of those were realizing that data-driven business reports had a real competitive advantage for their organizations. Now, of course, during the pandemic, for example, there's a whole bunch of different data points that we were learning from, and therefore that gave us some confidence in building some long-term business changes. We have, as an organization, have talked about some of those challenges that have been faced before, so I certainly won't go through those now, but I'm sure most of you have faced challenges during the pandemic as well, and certainly the data was there to provide some, hopefully, respite in terms of how we can actually make some of these strategic decisions. So how does that come back to actually supporting business goals using architecture? Well, the first challenge, and I say challenge, certainly from my experience, maybe we have too many of these, I guess, but the first challenge, let's say, is to actually identify your business goals. So we've listed a few here, some common ones that we come across from our customers. It really depends on your organization, the capabilities that you have in terms of what you're focusing on. But really, that is the important word, focus. All of us quite likely would like to tackle some of these business goals. We all want to produce roadmaps. We all want to build some innovative features. We all want to reduce our costs and seeing a movement to cloud. Tackling all of these at the same time is essentially where a lot of the pitfalls come. And so you should hopefully be focusing your efforts on some individual business goals at the beginning to prove the value of the architecture. I see it all the time. People question the value of enterprise architecture. People ultimately start questioning their roles as architects, but it's having that focus on a few key areas, showing that you can deliver some value, and then that helps snowball into other use cases and other teams that eventually will get on board then as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus maybe just on 3 of these, just to drill down into some of the aspects that we find useful for actually starting off these business goals and how architecture can effectively support those. So the first is scenario management and risk management, and also a bit more of a focus around cybersecurity. A lot of this stems from a organization's ability to actually detect and respond to, I guess, from a cybersecurity perspective, that's usually the unknown or the unexpected. So an architecture is there to actually help map out parts of that organization. So there are some key questions that you would typically ask if you were trying to, let's say, aim at this type of goal. So the first is things like, well, what technology do these departments use and at what level? That's important because we think of risk management. Technologies coming to end of vendor support. Those technologies are supporting highly critical applications or processes. We need to be aware of where the vulnerabilities may lie in the future. From a security perspective, and certainly cybersecurity, there are things that can help in this domain. Things like NIST and SABSA as notations and frameworks. NIST has vulnerability databases that you can use. These can go hand in hand with that architecture work. The other is actually understanding how breaches would occur and what that impact would be. So not only do we want to identify certain technologies, we also want to plan ahead and actually build some views of what those breaches would look like. So that could be impact on the services we provide. It could be impact on the customer experience. It doesn't have to be big ticket items. They could be small changes that happen over time and essentially accrue into failed capabilities and failed services. And then also we want to make sure that we actually build those scenarios, like I mentioned, for those future events. So when you are actually building these types of scenarios, there's a few fundamental things to keep in mind. The first is a lot of organizations might treat AA, and certainly less so these days, I would say, but as a single office job. Most of the EA work that I see from customers is a communication one where we're actually opening up dialogue with other departments. We want to make sure that we can actually see the scope of work that's required across the organization. Traditionally, you probably hear the terms in here, things like shadow IT, but that is, again, a fundamental issue with cybersecurity. Organizations and users are downloading tools they shouldn't be, therefore having vulnerabilities within the organization, and the organization has no idea. So it's a case of opening dialogue with those departments and making sure that we can actually build a relevant inventory of that data. There are some industry standards, like I mentioned, things like SABSA and NIST, which can give you a bit of a quick start, a bit of an accelerator to actually model these types of goals and scenarios. But we'd also recommend using things like the integrations and APIs to make sure that you're treating your data as near live as possible. Of course, that's not always possible. We can't always have a direct feed constantly from every system that we use, but we try our best to build a platform that can actually incorporate data from all of these areas. Ultimately, from a communication perspective, let's say, we then want to visualize that data. And we'll touch a bit more on the visualizations later on, but one of the key themes you'll see throughout these goals or objectives is actually building dashboards of that content, providing dedicated views for the organization, accessible to everyone, not just diagrams we draw in tools, but actual visualizations and data points and insights that's then available through platforms like Teams and SharePoint and Confluence, putting the data in the areas that these teams actually work, rather than in a separate dedicated site, let's say. And then also, for all of that content, even if we are building dashboards, we might want to make that data slightly more interactive. We want to give the ability for people to navigate through their own models. They might want to drill down into certain data points. We don't always want to provide users with a common scenario of, I have a question, therefore I have to ask someone, they have to build the view for me, I have to wait for the view to be built, and then I have my answer. We really do want to kind of emphasize a bit more of the self-service environment, where users can actually then drill down into the data that they see that's relevant for their domain, for their department, for their goal. Okay. Now, the second type of goal is road mapping and modeling. Now, both terms, I would say, are relatively loaded terms, and they can mean different things to different people. Are we building technology roadmaps, business roadmaps, strategic ones? Are we modeling processes, applications, data? But really, road mapping and modeling, for us, certainly from a road mapping perspective, falls generically into 4 different types. So one of the first things that we would typically do from a road mapping perspective is actually tag elements with suggestions. Okay, so the architecture can actually help us do this, and we can tag things with a classic tolerate, invest, migrate, eliminate status, and that can be classified as, let's say, a type 1 roadmap in terms of what's going to be changing. Type 2 looks a bit more at the when, so life cycle charts, useful if we have end of life dates for our products, internal end of life dates, and external ones such as end of vendor support. We typically classify them as those two types. I usually say things you can control and things you can't. So certainly end of vendor support lifecycle dates are out of your hands unless you move to a different vendor. Certainly your internal end of life dates are something you can control. So that's a key thing to keep in mind when you build these types of charts as well. The third type are around work packages, maybe more familiar things like projects and programs. This is a piece of work to then actually make a change within the organization. And type 4 are what we classify as multiple architectures, where we can actually build different scenarios. Some of the terminology here you'll actually see across different notations. Later on, we'll do a brief overview of notations like ArchiMate and TOGAF, but certainly from a pure modeling and road mapping perspective, regardless of the framework and notation, these are still the types of activities that you want to be carrying out as an architecture team. For each of those roadmaps, essentially those points listed on the left-hand side are some of the key benefits initially and how you'd actually get from start to finish for building those roadmaps. Those 5 points are essentially condensed 5 points from 5 sets of slides. So if you're interested in specifically the road mapping aspects, we can certainly send that data through to you as well. But the road mapping aspects really should be part of the overall architecture. You are building a view of what you look like today in order to build a view of what you want to look like in the future. And that's a key aspect of EA. We can do all the work to capture what we look like, but we really need to make sure that we can actually drive some insights into that and make suggestions for the future, which is part and parcel of the role of the EA. It's not just to tell the organization what it's doing wrong, but it's also to suggest how it can actually be improved. Those scenarios, again, coming back to this dashboarding environment, is where we'd actually show some of the stakeholders the work that we've carried out. Okay, and keep in mind, again, we have different teams involved. The architecture team building all the modeling, the views, all of that done within a core tool is perfectly fine. We don't typically want to show all of that modeling work now to our stakeholders. What they're likely more interested in are the higher level metrics. And so if we produce 2 scenarios, an as is and maybe an application rationalization project, we want to go through that trade-off. Have our costs increased or decreased? Does the availability of applications improve? Have we reduced the application landscape complexity? These are the types of metrics that users may be interested in. And if they wanted to, they could see the drill down work if they want to know the detail. But again, know your audience and be specific about what metrics you show to which stakeholders. The third one in here is application rationalization and transformation. Again, I think almost every organization I've dealt with has gone through this goal or objective. And architecture is fundamental, and if not, one of its key strengths is actually to support something like a transformation program. The checkboxes in here are some of the steps that we've seen customers go through, and therefore some best practices and recommendations of where to actually start. So one of the fundamental aspects that architecture can actually help in these situations is first building up an inventory. Okay, we speak to customers who have data in multiple locations, whether it's Excel spreadsheets, Visio diagrams, other tools. We really want to try and build up a single source of truth for that data. The other fundamental part of this, that final point in the application inventory list, is to actually link this information together. Typically, EA teams struggle when there are siloed data sets. We have HR systems capturing data, We have content in ServiceNow and AWS and Azure. We also have dedicated process modeling tools, and we have a couple of departments who manage stuff on their own Excel spreadsheets, which aren't standardized. This is hopefully what an EA team and fundamentally what an EA tool can help with. Standardizing, linking that content together, and providing that single repository for that content. Keeping that repository up to date, also obviously highly critical. So making sure that you can actually leverage connections to other tools, use concepts like APIs and workflows to make sure that data is near real time as possible. And that all helps them from an application perspective for providing some kind of strategic direction for the organization. So whether that's the tolerate, invest, migrate, eliminate models I mentioned earlier on, whether it's building cloud readiness reports, whether you have a cloud migration strategy, all of these things can come into play. When we actually take a look at that data, there's a key aspect to keep in mind, which is we may be bringing in data from other sources. We may be populating data manually within a tool, but also what a tool hopefully should be able to support you in doing is actually building insights into the data when that data is missing. So one of the things that we work with customers on is building algorithms within the model. For example, we may know things like the application is SaaS-based or desktop-based. We know it's supporting highly critical processes. We know we have over 500 users. However, we also know that it's actually using unsupported technology. The insights from that data come from then building things like a business fit and a technical fit score. Let's use the data we have to build new insights, which can then drive the recommendation. So you can see on the chart in the top left, we effectively split this into quadrants, which some of you have already done before in your teams. And ideally, what you'll find is anything in the top right-hand quadrant is something we want to invest in. Anything in the bottom left-hand corner, probably something we want to retire. So a low biz tech fit score. So these algorithms, these formulas can be really useful. And certainly we've seen some great results from our customers using these and some of the machine learning concepts that we have to actually drive insights into information and data points that they already have. Now, what's typically supporting all of that content are the frameworks. Now, frameworks are going to be useful for many different purposes. The fundamental aspect, which hopefully most of you are aware, is it does provide a good structure, and that really helps organizations align some of the business and IT concepts that they're working in. What they also offer are some suggestions, best practices. They offer data that you can reuse. They offer building blocks that you can actually reuse across your models. So they are a very good use of your time initially to determine what kind of frameworks you actually want to use. The questions you should be asking, though, is, well, is that framework fit for purpose? So a common one, let's say, is we need to be modeling our application landscape, and we want to use something like IT for IT, for example. It has all the benefits in there that we could use. It's not beneficial to then use something like a business process modeling notation for our application landscape. So choosing the framework that's fit for purpose. So the stakeholders are usually our first cause of concern. Who are we actually trying to address with these models? Is it a technical team or is it a less technical team? Because when we choose our frameworks, we want to make sure that there's actually scope in there for both the business and technology views that we create. We might use something like the business motivational model, but we might likely have to combine that with aspects from something like TOGAF around applications and technology to build that end-to-end view. Also, something that's actually quite useful, which I've seen, but maybe not as often as I would hope to see, is a maturity level scale to those frameworks. You would have heard, of course, of things like TOGAF, and you would have heard the Open Group themselves talk around how it's useful in certain situations. But I still come back to the whole concept of TOGAF, for example, is a toolbox like many other frameworks. You use the bits that are necessary for the use cases that you're working on. If you decide one day you want to use all of TOGAF, that's a big ask, and it's certainly not going to work from day one. You need to make sure that you can actually adapt your organization and adapt those frameworks to fit with those use cases and fit with those goals that you're trying to work on. There is another key aspect of this as well, which is you may choose a framework or a notation. However, in the future, things may change. Now, frameworks and notations are constantly being updated, and by those organizations, of course, and I'll come to that in the next slide. But you also want to make sure that it's actually adaptable. So we've termed this idea of hybrid frameworks. And for most of our customers, we're finding that they're using hybrid frameworks. Now, hybrid doesn't actually have to mean a complete restructure. It could be something as simple as looking at something like a TOGAF methodology using the ArchiMate notation. It could be looking at the ArchiMate notation and extending that with aspects from BPMN. Of course, UML aspects, which are the basis for something like ArchiMate, of course, then have some correlation. So you'll find that there's a fit somewhere where you have a specific domain that you want to model, and some, maybe not all, frameworks cover aspects of that. So combining those becomes really useful. Just a quick comment on the different types in here. So of course, you heard me mention TOGAF and ArchiMate, and of course, we'll focus on those two in a few minutes. But these are industry standards. You could think of industry standards across specific areas like APQC have process classification frameworks. So they provide some really good process and capability models for specific industries. BIAN, a very specific one for something like financial institutions. And then we also have ones across specific areas like defense and government versus, let's say, what we've called these as private companies, where we're developing our own. So we've developed our own framework, which we think is a relatively good best practice of other models and notations. And many of our customers tend to develop their own as well, which again is usually hybrid models. You can see in here we mentioned unlimited frameworks and notations. The real reason for that is you have the flexibility to build your own models. Again, anyone picking up something like TOGAF, it's not going to be perfectly fit for purpose for every single organization. Slight tweaks, slight adaptations, best practices that you can implement will make it perfect for your organization. So let's jump into a couple of these, just to go through some of the concepts and just to explain how these can be used in different ways. So here's the ArchiMate notation. I'm going to safely say that the majority of you are very familiar with. Now, there are benefits to using frameworks and industry standards, like I mentioned. However, there are benefits to using these in line with tools. Okay, so certain tools will have concepts that they can map quite well to ArchiMate standards notation. As a very quick example, something like a composition relationship in ArchiMate can be a natural hierarchy. Something like modeling plateaus in ArchiMate is really useful for tools that support scenario modeling. So you don't always have to use the notation's concepts, because sometimes tools can actually provide those as direct UI elements or direct features from the tool. Now, of course, you can use ArchiMate without a tool. You can do EA without a tool. But the benefits would be there to be had to actually combine both of those together. The notation itself is also key for communication. We will come back to this later on, but not all organizations want to communicate their views via the ArchiMate notation. And what I mean by that is organizations want to use the notation for the architecture, but their stakeholders want to see something else. They want to see more dynamic visualizations. They want to see the metrics. They don't necessarily want to see the architecture work going on underneath. So I'll take you through a quick example using the notation, just to highlight how some of these areas can actually be quite useful across, in this case, using Abacus, but you won't tell just because it's the notation itself. So ArchiMate has a viewpoint, which is a layered viewpoint, just a slice through the architecture. So what we're actually doing here is taking a look at one of those slices for a particular organization as an example. And the first thing we're seeing is a modeling of something like a customer as a role. That role then may have relationships across the model to business services. Those flow down into business events and business processes. Also a few other roles and actors on the right there. Moving from the business domain, you'll find yourselves pushing down into things like the application services and the application components that support those functions and those processes. And ultimately, we will reach a level where we look at things like the technology and the infrastructure as well. ArchiMate notation applied to a relatively standard diagram, let's say. Now, all of this content is useful for the architecture team. However, what's also key to keep in mind is the view that you want to present to your audience, and the stakeholders are going to be taking a look at these views. If we just had the ability to produce diagrams, one thing we want to ask is, well, what does our audience want to get from this view? So the first thing is, generically from an architecture perspective, it's really useful to see these relationships and how they're supporting each other. I now know if our banking system goes offline, that's going to be affecting some of the integrations it has with other applications. And ultimately, I can make the assumption that the customer will be affected to some extent. Other teams might be more interested in other ways of seeing this data. So we should be able to transform this relatively easily to show something like cost. Let's highlight what each application component and each application service costs us within the organization. Other team members might be more interested in something like bottlenecks within the process. Or if we think of these as customer journey steps, where are the actual pain points that customers are facing? They struggle to register. They're clearly very happy from a payment perspective, but registering is clearly a big issue. So if we highlight these things and heat map these things, it makes it much easier to focus on the areas that are causing issues. Same notation for an ArchiMate perspective. We're just visualizing stuff for different audiences and different stakeholders. The other thing we might do is actually go through a transformation project. So in this case, we might actually align a couple of these applications into a single application. And that's because we actually want to see if there's going to be some cost saving. This is a particular area where tools can be quite helpful because they can automate a lot of this for you. So as an example, you can see on the screen here, we have an application and that application has an outline in green and it has a little plus icon in green as well. What we're actually looking at is a future state view of this particular architecture. And what we can also do is compare that to the current state view, which we can highlight things in different colors to identify where those changes are being made. Now, traditionally, what that would actually look like is a side-by-side diagram, and we can just visually see what the differences are side by side, almost spot the difference. The benefits tools have is they can actually highlight this for us, and they can actually start making suggestions and allow us to move this data up and down current states and future states. So just by leveraging some of the capabilities to actually visualize that data, again, is an important aspect, not just from an ArchiMate perspective, but generically across other frameworks as well. Like I mentioned earlier on, these types of scenarios that we model from an ArchiMate perspective are typically plateaus, but like I've mentioned, tools will also support the actual scenarios themselves within the actual models. Now, another area that might be familiar, of course, is something like TOGAF. This is a good example. These are some of the example viewpoints that TOGAF suggests are useful for architecture teams. Again, one of the pitfalls here, and I've seen this previously using Microsoft's framework methodology for enterprise architecture, is you don't want this to turn into a box checking exercise where we say, yep, we have our principles catalog, we have our projects list, we have our event views, we have our value streams, because essentially you end up with a repository full of content that no one asked for. So again, there's focus that's required on some of these areas. Our goal from an application rationalization perspective will be to start building some of those technology views and application views. If we had our PMO team involved, of course, there'd be much more focus on the project and the requirements management. So it's choosing the viewpoints that are useful at that point in time. Yes, you may ultimately end up with all of these views, but they are produced in time for the work that's going on, rather than just for the sake of a box checking exercise. Again, treat these frameworks as a bit of a toolbox where you can actually use the areas that are necessary for those goals and objectives. TOGAF, like many other frameworks, of course, supports things like business scenarios as well. There are different approaches to this. So some of the users are familiar with the ADM cycle in here. There are going to be different phases that you go through, but essentially this gather, analyze, and then collaborate on the data is a fundamental part of actually building those business scenarios. Finally, we have the Avolution framework. This is actually just a graph view showing you some of the concepts, but essentially the Avolution framework is just a hybrid framework that we've built. And we have new EA teams that are using Abacus. We have EA teams that have been around for years who are looking to migrate their content to Abacus. Regardless, something like an Avolution framework really just, again, acts as a bit of an accelerator. So if you think we don't know anything about TOGAF and ArchiMate, or we know everything about them and we don't want to use them, then of course you can use some of the more standardized frameworks that we have as an accelerator because you don't want to focus too much on the theory. Again, the benefits here vary. We have a standard framework that we've built. So we have collateral and reports and dashboards around this, again, which can help kickstart some of these projects. But keep in mind, of course, we're agnostic as a tool. We don't care what framework you use, whether you create them from scratch. All our team here are to support our customers. We have ArchiMate certified consultants. We are there to make sure that we can actually build these models and make sure they provide value. And it's the same internally for your teams. Regardless of what framework you use, you should still be able to get the outcomes that you need, as long, of course, as I mentioned, it's tailored to the use cases that you're working on. So then we come to actually communicating that data. So the frameworks are there to help us build a structure. We're focusing on specific use cases and goals. We've built our architectures and our models. We've built different scenarios. And we've got to the point where we can actually make some decisions on that data. And now we actually need to communicate it to a wider audience. This statement hopefully is relatively evident, but data visualizations are graphical displays of abstract data or information. Two reasons. We want to make sense of the data, make it really easy so users can actually understand what we're trying to communicate. And secondly, on that communication point, we want to make sure that it is then available for all the team to see. It's not views we're hiding for specific reasons. The more we can actually share across the organization, the higher the likelihood is that there are going to be some more positive outcomes. Some may argue, well, why do we actually need data visualizations? We have the data, we know what it looks like. However, most of that might be in the form of what you see the data as. As an example, here's a set of data. A whole bunch of different numbers on the screen. And if I was to ask you to count how many times the number 9 appears, that's a very easy task, but it's certainly not quick, and it's certainly not efficient. So data visualization means we should start using the skills that we have to make sure that it is efficient and it is obvious to the user what we're actually searching for. The first thing is we can highlight some of those numbers. But really, if it's that important, we should make it much more obvious where that number 9 appears. And arguably still, we should just be delivering the count of how many 9s there are. So data visualization plays an important part. So from more of a real world example, this is something you'll often see. There's a table of data, a few different services that we have and costs over the years. As a visualization goes, it can be useful. We can see costs, we can see what those costs look like over the years, and we can see all the services that we have and the increase and decrease of those costs. Again, it's not the most efficient way of actually showing that data. From an architecture perspective, we could model these as components, and we can have almost like a traffic light system that shows the costs of those services. Realistically, though, the most appropriate chart for this particular instance is to use something like a line chart. Let's see the increase and decrease of those services over time. And more specifically, we might just want to provide some focus, some emphasis on a single data point or a single service. So just because we have the data, just because we can show it in certain ways, doesn't mean we don't need to look at the best way of showing that information. Again, all of this is just communication to our audience. It's effectively silent communication. We're not telling them this is what we have. We provide these views through dashboards and self-service environments, and then those users can actually leverage those views. One of my favorite visualizations of why perspective matters are these two views. So the view on the left is actually an interesting project. A few years ago now, it's a statistics project by someone called Alberto Cairo. The reason I quite like the one on the left is all of these data points are moving around, essentially providing different visualizations, sometimes, in this case, views of a dinosaur. The interesting aspect of this is the outcome of those data points. Now, the outcome of all of those data points on the left-hand side, regardless of the configuration, is they all have the same average, the same mean, the same standard deviation, and they all actually have the same correlation of values. So just because we have exactly the same data points and we have exactly the same outcome, doesn't mean we can't move that around to show the view that we want to show to our audience. And on the one on the right is really just a nice visual cue, I think, of what initially might seem like unstructured data. Most of the time, the architecture is there to actually find patterns and find structure within that data. Another fundamental reason of why EA should be structuring their data correctly. To maybe the untrained eye, like I mentioned, it's unstructured. For us as EAs, we need to make sure that we can actually communicate that in the best way for our stakeholders. And of course, all of that leads to a number of different benefits across the organization. We have consistency in the way we communicate. We have standards that we use. It effectively makes us make better decisions. If we can clearly see, for example, the cost increasing or decreasing, we can make good strategic decisions. If we can clearly heat map views according to where technology is reaching end of vendor support, or we're not compliant with certain regulations, or we have high level risks within the organization, the way we can actually communicate that will lead to better decision making. And also a key one on here is this better response from all stakeholders. Like I mentioned earlier on, we often hear the words of does EA deliver value? And you'll often read and hear blog posts around how maybe EA is dead one day and it's not the next. The key thing here from a stakeholder perspective is I think EA, certainly across our customers, certainly across the industries and events I've joined recently, is broadening. More people are getting involved, more teams are interested in the outputs. It's less enterprise architecture framework focused, it's more outcome deliverable focused, which is essentially why EA, I guess, was started. Maybe in that sense, that's effectively how we can actually help support that going forward, is to make sure that we can effectively communicate the role of EA, the role of the goals that we have, and all those data points actually then can provide these types of benefits. So finally, what I want to quickly cover is just a 2 or 3 use cases, or in this case, sorry, case studies from some of our customers. I don't want to go through this in too much detail for 2 reasons. The first is we already have these case studies on our website, so you can take a look at them. But secondly, our customers have actually presented their use of our tool, but more importantly, the outcomes that they've achieved by adopting enterprise architecture with a data-driven focus. And it's best to hear that from our customers through links that we can send you. But just to give you a high-level view, the first one in here is NXP. They're a world leader in semiconductors, and that means pretty much every single device you own probably has a semiconductor in it, whether it's from cars to your phone. But really their big picture view of Abacus, let's say, and EA was to improve some of the insights that they have, particularly around business processes, but certainly tying that back to things like applications and risks. Again, it's very rare that we see organizations model a single domain, The benefit of EA, of course, is the links across the model. Processes use applications, applications have risks, and therefore those risks ultimately tie back to the process. So they've had a few key benefits from Abacus. In their case, based in the Netherlands, so they were combining ArchiMate and BPMN. They use pretty much a lot of the ArchiMate notation and parts of BPMN to extend on the detail they could model their processes in. And they focus specifically on things like the costs and impact of change that were being made. So a lot of their use cases stemmed around M&As as well, actually understanding how combining and merging with other organizations, a whole new set of applications and processes, and how those different scenarios can actually be managed. Again, using the flexibility of the frameworks was key. Like I've mentioned previously, not all of their stakeholders wanted to see ArchiMate notation. They were essentially tailoring their dashboards for their users. The second is KLP, a financial services organization. Theirs was interesting at a time when something like GDPR, and as much as I guess that's still an important topic, was at the height of being important because it was just being rolled out with certain penalties attached to it. So their idea was they wanted to ensure a level of compliance within Abacus, and certainly within their EA team, they were using their data for target-driven models as well. What's our level of compliance today? And what level of compliance do we actually need to reach in the next 3, 6, and 12 months' time? So they could adapt some of the models that were available out of the box. They were actually integrating data from other sources, and then they were actually sharing that through their organization, both internal and external organizations, to show evidence of compliance as well. This was a pure data-driven model. With all of that data coming in, they needed to know quite quickly and almost instantly from a stakeholder perspective, which data is no longer adhering to one of these principles or compliance standards like GDPR, and what do we need to change to make sure it is? What new capabilities do we need to introduce? Which new processes do we have to change? And where do we actually need to put new controls in place into the organization? So they were using that data to back up some of those strategic long-term decisions they had to make. They weren't affecting them now. GDPR wasn't in effect, but they knew it was going to be, and therefore they had to make sure that they made some forward planning decisions in that case. And finally is Sophos, a UK leader around security software for endpoint detection and cloud security. Theirs was a very interesting use case, actually, and I think it's evident, hopefully, by virtue of a security company using a tool to manage their security is hopefully a good sign. But one of the key things that they were working on was actually to first build an inventory, of course, of their components, so their applications, their services and technologies. But they were leveraging some of the algorithms to actually score some of the scenarios. So a pure data-driven model. They were understanding the impact a breach would have, the likelihood of that, who would be affected, and the impact not just from a technology perspective, but from a business perspective. The key thing in this case were the algorithms, like I mentioned. A lot of their data points may have been relatively empty. They maybe had some idea of some of the shadow IT. They had some idea of where their critical processes were connecting to vulnerable applications. But using algorithms and machine learning, they could essentially fill in the blanks and actually make some suggestions across their data. More importantly, again, that final benefit, they obviously have to then communicate that up and down their stack, from certain teams who need all of the details of what's happened, so very technical views, to the very high level top views of these are the cost implications if we don't fix some of these risks that we have. Cost always comes up, which is unsurprising. And all of those goals I showed at the beginning and some of the use cases that our customers work on, cost does tie back at one of those levels. We have customers working on building technical debt scores using ArchiMate right now. Those scores are relatively detailed. They're looking at the infrastructure, the technology, where they've issued waivers, where they're still supporting something because it will be end of life in the next 6 months, so there's no point fixing the technology now. very good architecture work, but the important bit is, well, how does that translate to some of the C-level? If our CFO asks us the question, I'm not going to tell them how complex our code base is. I'm going to tell them that the tech debt will accrue a fixed penalty and their increased costs over the next 6 months if we don't review our technology landscape. So again, it's about trying to communicate that to the right audience at the right time. Like I mentioned, all of these case studies are going to be available, and you can hear our actual customers speaking about how they've used Abacus and how they've used EA as a data-driven platform to solve their business goals and their objectives. But finally, maybe from my side, as a quick thank you again to everyone who's joined. I probably fitting that we started on a quote from Sherlock Holmes, so I guess we should probably finish on a quote. This one's quite interesting. I quite like this one. This is from the former Netscape CEO, Jim Barksdale. I think maybe at the time when things were going rightly or wrongly in the right direction, I guess. His quote was, "If we have data, let's look at data. If all we have is opinions, then let's go with mine." So thank you, everyone. And I think we can probably open the floor to questions. Now, I realize there are a few people on the call, Peter, so maybe a chat review, or if we can see something coming in, I can certainly address those.
So well, first of all, thank you. Let me see. Yeah, there's a question from Joost. How does your tool differentiate from your competitor? Okay.
Yeah, I'll answer that quickly, so I don't treat this as a sales opportunity. I'm not the sales guy, so I'll leave that to the sales team. But the quick one, maybe from a differentiating perspective, we have, let's say, two approaches. We have this diagram-driven approach, the classic EA approach of configuring views, drawing something, and we present that back. And then we have the data-driven aspect, which is using algorithms and machine learning. So the machine learning aspect is essentially our key differentiator, I would say, in terms of the algorithms. That's been a bit of a game changer, from not just from what we're seeing from customers, but within the industry as well. It's essentially leveraging the data that you already have, so we can start making predictions. So you might not know the criticality of your applications, but Abacus can suggest what that is based on applications that have similar values and therefore similar criticality values. It's a basic example, but you'll see a lot more of that coming up in the next few months. If you're interested in that, by the way, take a look at our website, download a trial. You'll have access to all of those capabilities.
Okay. So here's one from Madeline Spears. We struggle to always get the data we need, especially costs. And cost seems to be one of its biggest drivers. What would be your recommendations for getting this data?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and it's what I've commonly seen across our customers. So the scenario would be an EA has been asked, generic, let's say. So an EA has been asked to reduce their application landscape costs. What they're struggling to do is actually get really detailed cost data to prove what the value is. Now, the argument in that situation is not just to not do the work, but to think, well, how do I get some variation of cost values? The common approach, so apart from machine learning and algorithms, is to review how we're actually capturing that information. Costs don't have to be numbers. At the beginning, for new EA teams and those who don't have the maturity of data yet, we would recommend starting with something like a low, medium, high score. We can all guess what that score is at the beginning, and that can be quite useful. The second part of that is we don't always have to guess. We can survey our users. Do you think this is a low cost or a high cost? If we don't know that, how many users are there? That will give us an indication of likelihood, how high or low that cost is. So even if you don't have those specific values, the recommendation is, of course, try to integrate with other systems, but start with, I'll say, generic values like low, medium, high. That, again, can even just help make some of the strategic decisions going forward.
Okay, next one from Karsten Kruse. Does Abacus allow diagram-driven input?
Yep. So hopefully, like most EA tools these days, you can draw diagrams. You can auto-generate diagrams. we think of diagrams and matrices and list-based views as a view into the repository, because diagrams are usually produced for a specific point in time or for a specific purpose, whereas something like dashboards and dynamic views provide a bit more real-time information that's constantly live. So yes, you can have diagram-driven input. The classic case again is, people coming over from, let's say, classic EA tools like Sparks or drawing tools like Visio and Draw.io, import that content that can drive the models. The diagrams can come first and the tables and lists later. It doesn't just have to be a pure data table view first. It can be diagram driven first.
Okay. And the last question from Funny Styles. What would be the best way to trace missing data?
Yeah, so I mentioned the machine learning aspect there. I will also quickly mention, if you take a look at something like the Sophos WebEx, that was an interesting one. What they'd actually done initially was collected a list of applications that they thought the organization owned and used. When they published that out to the wider audience, to the entire organization, I think that almost tripled in size. The shadow IT, the stuff that they couldn't see, allowing users to actually enter in data is one of the first things to, let's say, fix missing data from your perspective of it being missing, let's say. When it comes to missing data around specific values, again, I would likely use some levels of attributions up and down the model. Let me quickly come back to the cost one. We don't necessarily know quite often the cost of our processes and capabilities, and that can be classified as missing data. What we can do is aggregate it up from the applications that support those processes, or from the infrastructure that's set up, or the licenses that we have in place that all support our capabilities and processes. So that's one of the best ways of tracing missing data, as opposed to just leveraging the connections that we have. Use the API, connect to other systems, pull data in, treat Abacus as a bit more of a platform for managing that part of the tool, rather than always thinking that it has to be manual. Automate as much as you can.
Okay, well, I don't see any more questions. If there are any, please do so now. Otherwise, thank you, Andrew. Hope to see you again sometime.
Likewise.
Yeah. And thank you all for watching. We will post the presentation, including the recording, on YouTube and on our library. So thank you all for joining. I will stop the recording now and see you next time at the Digital Architects Network.